Hi, my name is Roger Kuhlman. I am a PhD chemist. I spent a career in chemical industry doing research primarily on plastics and more particularly on polyethylene, which is a kind of plastic, and especially developing catalysts to improve polyethylene products and processes. Some of you may think that means I spent decades in a dark room sitting around cackling and rubbing my palms together and trying to come up with ways to pollute the environment and to poison people. That seems to be the caricature drawn of industrial researcher these days, especially within the plastics industry. But you know, industrial researchers are researchers, they're scientists. They tend to be more aware of environmental issues, for example, than the general public. And, it's just because their career happened to go in the direction of an industrial career doesn't mean that, you turn off your social conscience or your awareness of societal and environmental concerns. And, as I look back on my career, my projects tended to fall primarily within one of three categories. The first one is process improvement. So I would work on trying to make the exact same product using an improved process, which means less energy. So basically, you make a water bottle, but you use less energy to make it. Less energy means less emissions, less carbon dioxide, less greenhouse gases, less global warming, less environmental footprint. The second is lifetime extension. So for example, say you have pipes, plastic pipes that today they last 10 years, but the thing about plastic is you can improve them. It's not like aluminum where it's some elemental compound that is always aluminum. The variations in plastics are seemingly endless, and there are always improvements to be made. And we made several improvements that allowed us to extend the lifetime of products such as pipes that maybe now they can last 20 years, for example. And then the third is something called down gauging. That means using less plastic to achieve the same result. So think about a plastic bag that's thinner now than it used to be, but you can still stuff just as many limbs or pizza boxes or whatever it is into it without it breaking. So these are very real advances that industrial researchers have been making over this last several decades in terms of plastic performance and production. And to be honest, they're all done with the idea of improving the bottom line of the company, but they all had a positive influence on the environmental impact. In other words, the environmental footprint was reduced from all of these projects. And that seems to be sort of a well-kept secret that industrial profits and environmental improvements tend to go hand in hand. Like, you don't generally look for processes that are less efficient or more polluting or products that are less efficient that require more of the product to get the job done. That's not the way to be competitive in the industry. So just the general competitiveness of the industry has led to these improvements which have decreased the environmental footprint. Now, I'm not saying that plastics have no environmental footprint. They do. But you think about what industrial researchers do. For the most part, they're making things more efficient and making things better. And that tends to mean less environmental footprint. And that was important to us as we were doing the research. And it's very important to me personally because I tend to think of things in an environmental framework. That's the number one influencer on the way I vote. When I see news about current events, that's the framework that I think about things. So I retired a few years ago, and I recently had an opportunity to give a presentation about plastic waste. And of course, I took sort of a unique approach to this for several reasons. Again, I'm very environmentally focused. That's just as a person, that's the way I think. But I do have a background in the plastics industry, and so that colors my thinking as well. But on top of that, I don't just believe people, and I don't just believe not only the public literature, but also the scientific literature. So I read things very carefully. I look at the data and I analyze the data myself, and I decide whether the conclusions in a scientific paper make sense or they don't. And I decide whether the procedures that the people use to produce that data were valid. So I don't just assume anything. So the way I prepared for this presentation is I would read something in the popular literature, so maybe Newsweek, maybe The Guardian, anything like that. They would generally give some sort of report, they would reference some scientific article, and rather than just glancing and saying, okay, they have a reference that must be true, I would read the scientific article, and I wouldn't just stop at reading what they said in the scientific article. I would look to see if they were correct. And, throughout my career, I've always tried to stay on sort of the border between industry and academics. I've always been very interested in the details about how things work, why they work the way they do from a scientific basis. And so I have about the same number of peer-reviewed publications that I do patents. I worked with several university professors throughout my career. But every team I worked on, we were always very focused on getting things right. That was always the number one thing. And we always would put aside any preconceived notions or perceptions that we had going into a project, and we would go where the data led us, not try to drag the data along to where we wanted it to go. And so when I was preparing for this presentation on plastic waste, I was very concerned about what I was seeing because I expected to see some, let's say, exaggeration or some clickbait kinds of descriptions of what was actually reported in the scientific literature. But what I found was the popular literature for the most part was just repeating what was said in the scientific literature, and it's the scientists themselves who were exaggerating and in a lot of cases actually just completely misrepresenting or completely getting things wrong. And one or two, I try to just kind of shake it off and keep going. And it's like, yeah, there's always going to be a little bit. But in certain fields, like, for example, microplastics research in general and microplastics effects on human health in particular, to my reading, there are more unreliable scientific articles in this field than there are reliable ones. And it just got a little bit overwhelming. I have contacted a number of the authors. They find out I have a background in industry and they clam up. They really are not interested in hearing any sort of critical review of their research, which makes me think that maybe they're not that confident in it if they can't answer some simple basic questions. These reports are peer reviewed. Who the peer reviewers are, why they aren't looking closer, why they're not asking the right questions, why they're not rejecting some of these papers outright is, I don't know. I mean, maybe they're not in the right field to ask the right questions, or maybe they feel some sort of political pressures, but I don't. I don't feel any political pressure. So I see what I see, and this is important because these papers, and especially the popular articles that are referencing them, they're shaping public policy and they're shaping legislation in a way that is often actually antithetical to the stated purpose of the legislation. In other words, they're doing more harm than good because they have bad information going in. And so that's kind of why I decided, I have to do something. There's only so much I can do. because there are so many articles now coming out so fast, and they so quickly go into the popular literature and influence the thinking of the policymakers. But I thought I need to do something to at least give people a chance to see the truth, to see what's really going on, to see what the true science is behind these things. So I decided to start these reviews to accomplish that. What I can tell you is that not all of the reviews, I'm not cherry picking the bad papers. So if I think the authors are right, I'll say so. If I think they're wrong, I'll tell you why. Why should you believe me? That's a really difficult problem for me. I know a lot of you won't, regardless of what logic dictates or what the arguments are. But I try very hard to explain the reasoning in a way that's understandable across the broadest audience I can. So unfortunately, some of my videos maybe go a little long because of that. But it's important to me to try to get you to understand what the problem is I have with the article, if there is a problem with the article, and what the weaknesses of the article may be, even if I don't necessarily know for sure that they're wrong, why we should at least treat their conclusions with caution. And then in a few instances I say, yeah, these guys are right. So I hope this is useful for people who really are interested in this field to form an opinion, or form a, not an opinion, but a scientific framework for thinking about these problems. And so that's why I'm doing it. I hope it's useful for some people. I don't know how many papers I'll get through. I have folders and folders full of them, and it takes me a lot longer to make a YouTube video than it does to read an article. But I will try to get out as many as I can, and I hope you find it useful. Thanks for watching, and there's more to come.